Good morning, everybody. This is a pre-record, so if you're watching this on Wednesday evenings, it is Saturday and things may have happened. Why do I say that? Well, today we are talking about Dungeons and Dragons and the OGL, the Open Gaming License. The Dungeons and Dragons community has been in uproar as Wizards of the Coast, the owners of Dungeons and Dragons, have sought not only to push players into their own online VTT, virtual tabletop system, creating their own self-contained ecosystem, but also exclude third-party creators who have been able to produce for over 2 decades Dungeons and Dragons materials under the Open Gaming License. The Open Gaming License being a specific document that gives permission to third-party creators to create D&D compatible materials within a certain, how might I put it, a certain limited threshold. So, to discuss this important topic for the D&D community, what the OGL is, what it means for D&D players, indeed what it means for tabletop role-playing games and humanity in general, I am joined by two of the smartest gamers I know, C. Derek Varn and Discourse Miniatures. How are you guys doing? See, you guys?
Oh, the applause! The applause!
You got applause. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You got applause. It's not only Jason who has a soundboard now. I have one too. And
That's the noise of this podcast, isn't it, Nye?
That is pretty much the noise of this podcast when we talk about Wizards of the Coast. So I wanted to start off, and perhaps I'll start with Varn on this point. If Varn, you could just explain to us what exactly the OGL is and why it matters. I kind of gave a little bit of a brief outline, but perhaps you can go into it in a little more depth.
Okay, so the OGL is something that was spearheaded as a license in the year 2000 with the release of 3rd edition. There's a couple of background pieces of information, and some of this is unique to the U.S. copyright system, but the Supreme Court has ruled in the United States multiple times, actually, that gaming mechanics is not a copyrightable thing. Now they weren't ruling specifically on the tabletop industry; they were ruling on the board game industry and the video game industry. But the OGL is interesting because what is confusing about tabletop is gaming mechanics and story mechanics are intertwined. So the exact line where gaming mechanics begin and story content begins has never been clearly adjudicated in a U.S. court. And TSR, the company that originally produced Dungeons and Dragons, was notorious for using that vagary to sue everybody. Once TSR was corporatized in the mid to late 80s, I think they sued all their competitors for pretty much everything. I remember always hearing about even companies like Chaosium being in lawsuits with TSR. They sued Gary Gygax. They were sue happy.
Litigious.
Right.
Yes.
And that litigiousness went all the way back to the early 80s with the first third-party supplements for the original Dungeons and Dragons, but sometimes they would allow it, sometimes they wouldn't. It wasn't particularly predictable. When Wizards of the Coast bought Dungeons and Dragons after TSR went bankrupt in 1996, Wizards of the Coast kept, releasing some AD&D stuff for a few years, but some members of the company wanted to assure the industry that they weren't going to sue people over third-party production. And they did a couple of things. It was spearheaded by Ryan Dancy and Wizards of the Coast lawyers. They came up with the D20 system trademark license and then the OGL. And one of the things the OGL did, created a system reference document where they were like, these are the mechanics and the story elements we're not contesting. All right. And with D&D, this is another thing that makes this really hard. A lot of D&D's elements, both mechanics and story elements, are taken from other stuff. They themselves, back in the TSR days, almost got sued by the token state multiple times.
What is it with companies and taking, previous IPs, if you want to call them that, but previous ideas, and then catching them inside their own properties and then trying to sue everybody else that uses any element of that potentially?
Yeah,
it's remarkable, really, isn't it? I mean, I believe they changed. The reason we have halflings instead of hobbits is because of the Tolkien estate. But yeah, I mean, I think especially in the gaming industry, we've seen with TSR and Games Workshop, these companies that have highly derivative properties, just suing everybody. But I think it makes sense. I mean, it's the iron law of their business. They appropriate something, and then they try and snuff out their competitors. And you can try and snuff out your competitors by producing a better product, or you could just sue them and scare them into submission.
There feels like there's an element of insecurity there as well, though.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
To get back into the legal stuff, this is where things get kind of interesting. This OGL movement spawned a whole lot of stuff. It created a glut of material that actually did kind of become a problem for early Wizards. But there was another side to that, and it's a side that I think was kind of under talked about the OGL, because I am one of these people who thinks the OGL was smart as a business move in ways that people don't understand. And what I mean by that is, by clarifying that they were going to just state in the system reference document all these things they were just going to say, okay, we're not going to consider these story elements. We're going to license them to you, and we're going to license these mechanics to you. Now, as I've said, it is unclear what they even need to license to other developers. That is completely, like, someone was asking me, for example, today, if they could claim the stats as story elements, and I'm like, well, they could try it, but the problem is D&D stole those themselves from wargaming. So like there's nothing, this was a very ad hoc industry, and the mechanics law is generally pretty clear. And it is kind of, the tabletop role-playing game industry is kind of weird in that what's mechanics and what's not is vaguer.
I just want to just ask Discourse here, as a attorney at law, or someone who is a recovering attorney at law. What's your take on this whole mechanics versus story elements discussion? Is it?
I'm gonna have to give you like the lamest answer ever and say I don't know. It's just super complicated. The problem is that you're dealing with like multiple jurisdictions. You're dealing with a very tricky, very complicated area of law. And to be perfectly frank, nobody knows. Like, that's the thing. Like, there isn't actually an answer. It hasn't settled, So that it takes courtrooms and it takes legal precedents, and I have no idea what would actually shake out.
It's determined. I people need to understand this. It's determined by case law, so this is not something like you can look up a statute and know. The U.S. copyright case law is somewhat clear about the mechanics issue, which is why like Avatar can't get sued for ripping off Dances with Wolves.
Boo!
I mean, boo, but also correct.
But also, Dances with Wolves, can I just say, is not a good movie, and it won
no,
an
it's
Oscar.
not.
It won an Oscar. It won an Oscar.
Many bad movies win Oscars. But one of the things that some of the people who have studied this have actually said what Wizards seem to be intending to do was to turn the D20 trademark and the unified mechanics into a like a DVD or DVD or a VHS license, and thus standardizing the industry where no matter if you want to play a different game, you have to buy their base book. And or you're going to be highly encouraged by their base book, even if there's a lot of even if mechanics are explained in other systems. Now, one of the interesting things about this is Wizards of the Coast owns the OGL itself, so they actually own the Open Gaming License, and that's going to become important later. It goes fine until 2008. Wizards of the Coast transitions to a royalty-free but super restrictive gaming system license that was available for third-party developers to publish content, but it made it a risk. Most of the things we're going to talk about in the leaked OGL version 1.1a or 1.1 is stuff that was actually attempted in the gaming system license for 4th edition, and that was stuff like if they don't like what you're doing, they can ask you to pulp everything that you're making. This led to a bunch of companies, and most famously Paizo itself, coming directly out of former employees of Wizards of the Coast, some of which apparently were involved in the drafting of the original OGL, taking their gaming supplements that they had made for D&D 3.5 and spinning it off to their own system. And the backlash against the gaming system license was so severe, and also there's some other weird things about D&D 4th Ed. Mechanically, it was strange. It was very video game-ish.
Well, this was the height of the MMO,
Yeah.
World of Warcraft. So, but you know, they were ultimately unsuccessful and lost their top spot as a role-play game.
Paizo Pathfinder overtook them, and we need to think about this happened at the time where the ecosystem that currently supports D&D 5th edition was developing. So, for example, back when no one had heard of a little guy called Matt Mercer, he was one of the first people doing live streams with actor-y people who could do good voice acting. For Pathfinder originally, actually. I mean, this is something that's often forgotten.
His improv group. I'm telling you. I mean, do you watch Critical Role Discourse? I actually don't.
I've tried to watch it. I actually like some of their game products, but I don't care about the show.
This time period was when I got into kind of Dungeons and Dragons, but I got into Pathfinder. And everyone referred to it as Dungeons and Dragons. So it was like you just play Pathfinder. It's basically D&D but better. Is kind of how it was always explained to me.
And just so people know, basically Pathfinder was kind of an edited version of the 3rd edition of Dungeons and Dragons, and the 4th edition, which Wizards of the Coast produced, while not necessarily being a bad game per se, was very different in its sensibilities. Was very orientated towards online play, and in fact,
online playing in combat,
online play and combat, and really was a kind of dry run for what is happening now. So, kind of to speed the conversation along, we get into Dungeons and Dragons and Wizards of the Coast after fourth edition, they bring back they create fifth edition, which is a little bit more like the older editions, a little bit streamlined, easy to play. They bring back the old OGL, and then you have this whole confluence of forces in the 2000s that leads to an explosion of D&D. People like fifth edition. You have things like Critical Role become extremely popular. People love their improv D&D improv group, so they start playing Dungeons and Dragons. You have the rising popularity of YouTube, where you have all these YouTube channels that are focusing on D&D. And in this ecosystem, you're also seeing many of those content creators producing their own materials under the OGL. So you have this huge ecosystem. D&D becomes kind of like a gravitational pull. By having the OGL, people and companies are encouraged to produce their materials to be compatible with the 5e 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons book. Even companies like Paizo, who produce their own system, Pathfinder, they start producing 5e books. You see a lot of different games having their own unique system and producing for 5e, because 5e Dungeons and Dragons basically becomes, as Wizards of the Coast wanted, a universal language because it is easy to produce for.
Yeah, I want to add one more thing there, because it actually is why this is so scary to the community, even if they played other games. Both the OSR and even things that are older than the OGL, such as Chaosium, Chaosium games, Call of Cthulhu, Delta Green. This is different. All these games have the open game license in them because Wizards had done the lawyer work all the way back in 2020. And if you agreed to using their own OGL, you just slap it in your own book and say, also, we're not going to sue you. Like, even though our mechanics aren't even related to the mechanics in the open system document. One thing I will say, another thing I do want to add, though, there were some hints with 5th edition that there were going to be problems later down the line. The system reference document, as released in 2015 for 5th edition, was small. So the parts of the game that was going to be allowed out to the community for development was a lot less of the game than they had done in 3rd E. But it really didn't end up mattering. One of the things about it is Wizards was much smarter about not overcreating itself. So the ecosystem actually kind of filled a gap, because they only Wizards went from releasing, God, in 3rd edition, I think they released 3 books a month, and for 5th edition, there is generally only 3 to 4 products released a year for the mainline RPG.
And people often feel overburdened with that as well.
Yeah.
So I wanted to turn to Discourse now. So as somebody who follows the gaming world as a professional, what would we call you? A gameographer? A game investigator?
A gameologist.
A gameologist.
Gameologist, yes.
As a professional gameologist, Discourse, what has happened over the course of the last year that has culminated in this massive meltdown in the D&D community, and people turning against Wizards of the Coast and Dungeons and Dragons, and finally people will bloody play a game other than D&D. I can convince people to go, hey, D&D are a big evil corporation. Come and play one of my bizarre games about like flying monkeys instead of D&D.
Yeah.
So,
DMs everywhere across the world, have been assembling this hodgepodge collection of different RPG and role-playing games, and now they're like, haha, finally, this is what I was waiting for.
Thanks, Wizards. So what's happened in the last year to radically change this? In 2021, D&D recorded record profits. It was riding high. They had a lot of good press out there. It was golden. What happened?
Well, people love Dungeons and Dragons. They really do. And I think partly of that is that the audience for Dungeons and Dragons right now is still relatively new. We're still looking at a time when I think a lot of people got into the games relatively recently. And so you've got like this big audience of people who are just kind of into Dungeons and Dragons. That might be the only RPG game they know. Again, it's kind of one of those situations where a lot of people get into TTRPGs and they find out about Dungeons and Dragons and they don't know there's a wider marketplace. So I actually think that this whole scandal and this outrage at the minute is actually helping a lot of people discover some other companies, which is kind of good actually. So I think it's been a long time coming. I think that this all started really with the well, I mean, if you really need to trace a line from something, I think it's probably the announcement of 1D&D, the 6th edition Dungeons and Dragons. And new editions of Dungeons and Dragons, I think new editions for most games are usually a pretty scary time for those games companies, because there's this kind of transition period where you've got to onboard people from one game to the other, which means that right now Wizards are entering a particularly vulnerable period of time. So people heard about 1D&D, and 1D&D, as much as it seems to be mechanically very similar to 5th edition, it's not like 4th edition. It's not like things are changing radically. The platform, the kind of business side of Dungeons and Dragons appears to be changing. They've been signaling a lot about virtual tabletop systems, about playing online, about the ancillary products that surround Dungeons and Dragons, things like Dungeons and Dragons Beyond, where you can manage your character sheet. And I think that some element of that is kind of fine. Most people, I know a lot of people who have Dungeons and Dragons Beyond subscriptions, who pay subscriptions to play Dungeons and Dragons every month. Wow. So there's been elements like that. I think that has begun to push the community slightly in a bit of a skeptical position. And then there was recently the Cynthia Williams, the president of Wizards of the Coast, was on an investor call with Chris Cox, the Hasbro CEO. And she mentioned that Dungeons and Dragons players are under monetized. And obviously that everyone's imagination started to whirl pretty reasonably, I suspect. And that was only last month. And then
where does Cynthia Williams come from in terms of her business background?
Well, she was originally, so she came from Microsoft originally. She was a vice president at Microsoft, but before that, she comes from Amazon. And then Chris Cox, he comes from Microsoft. And then he was the president of Wizard of the Coast, and now he's CEO of Hasbro. Mm-hmm. So you can see they've all got these shared backgrounds in video games. And I do think that we can trace a lot of the insecurity in the community back to what's happened with video games, as you know, and the monetization that's occurred that I think we've talked to you about a lot on the podcast already. But recently, then there was a leak of the new open game license terms was leaked out to the community pretty selectively, I will say. The worst terms were basically revealed, and then we got a little bit of a drip feed of new bad terms, and then boom, like out of nowhere, we suddenly got the full new OGL 1.1a, they're called, the new 1.1a terms, which make a whole host of changes to the original open licensing agreement. And it has set the community on fire. People are not happy at all. And people have been mobilized, I think, in a lot of ways, by influencers, by YouTubers, by third-party creators. You know, like all of these people have assembled their own little audiences of people who might play Dungeons and Dragons. They might be Dungeons and Dragons fans, but they're also fans of other content creators as well. And this is going to directly impact on those content creators in a really adverse way. Matt Mercer, Critical Role, right? Like there's risks to that company. I think that Wizards are finding out that actually there's a lot more fans in D&D of Critical Role than just of Wizards of the Coast, the company, you know?
Do you think Wizards of the Coast have completely misjudged their place in the market? And if so, why do you think they've misjudged the Discourse?
100%. Yeah, 100%. So I think that I mean, if we look at the background of Cynthia Williams and Chris Cox, I mean, they come from industries like Cynthia Williams is from Amazon. She worked there for a long period of time. I think it might have been around 10 years. And Amazon is a company that can force through changes into the marketplace. And there's going to be very little pushback from the community because mean, who's the Amazon community, right? Like Amazon can just steamroll its opposition. But Dungeons and Dragons, role-playing games in general, they are value-driven marketplaces. Consumers in those marketplaces, they want to buy products from companies that they believe represent and reflect their values. And Wizards of the Coast has misunderstood that, because now when they're bulldozing through these small independent third-party publishers, people see that and they don't like it. Everybody loves an underdog story, and demolishing your competition is not viewed very well.
So they've misjudged the moral economy of Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah. That's a really good way to put it. Yeah, they've misjudged the moral economy.
What are your thoughts, Varn, on the kind of actions of Wizards of the Coast to try and force through these changes? And I would say, the new OGL that was leaked had these terms like you have to pay royalties on a certain amount of money gross. D&D can revoke, can basically stop you producing at any time. They can change their contract within 30 days. A whole host of stipulations, which frankly, honestly, I think many of these stipulations were so bad that Wizards of the Coast knew that people would not be able to produce under this. And then the only people they would work with would be people who would sign a separate bilateral agreement with them. So basically, I mean, and of course, as in our age, the justification Wizards of the Coast is like, well, we don't want people to produce hateful and racist products. Of course, a classic liberal business tactic to try and obfuscate what is ultimately a power move. But Varn, what are your thoughts on the misjudgment of Wizards of the Coast?
Well, there's a lot going on there. I mean, one, one of the things that we need to be real specific about, the two things that really shock people. The attempt to revoke a license that even the designers, Rank Dancy, and then people at Paizo who worked with them, and Monty Cook, who also worked with him on his own game company, all said the intention of this was to be irrevocable. That language was not common in legal documents in 2000. It is now clearly common because of some changes in international IP law, but the license is older than that. And the move to revoke it was also going to mean that people were going to have to pulp prior products and take them off the market. So that kind of hostility, I mean, that's bigger than just suing. That's like, we're not just going to, end your company. We're going to bury all your products. And by the way, since everybody, even people who don't use any of our IP, have been using this OGL for years because it's the industry standard. I'm signaling I'm not going to sue anybody, and also don't sue me. It means they can claim all kinds of things from competition that even predate, like I said, the OGL. One of the things I think they misjudged, and their statement yesterday is also a misjudgment, because they're claiming like, we were just workshopping this, and why did you send out NDAs? Like, you have multiple people who refused to sign the NDA.
They asked content creators were expected to sign. Like, they sent these out to be signed 100%.
Yeah, and why did you only give them a week to sign a 93-page document that completely destroyed people's businesses? You were expecting that Hasbro is big enough not to be sued, which I was also like, that doesn't make sense. So while they could claim, like, look at new TSR, look at Legends of the Flame, although I'm not sure that Legends of the Flame Princess is even covered by the OGL, because OSR products sometimes are and sometimes aren't. It depends on the company. Again, like I said, mechanics, particularly old mechanics of a non-active system, aren't copyrighted. I mean, they're not copyrightable in the United States. It's European law is weirder, and actually on this, so it's And that's another complication is, you know, yeah, like in the 80s, yeah, TSR was sold in Britain and you could get it elsewhere, but like they really only had to deal with 2 legal jurisdictions, or 3, the United States, Canada, and England. And England had actually usually subsidiary producers who handled that anyway. That's the whole birth of Games Workshop in the first place.
Yeah, Discourse's favorite company in the whole wide world.
Right. But the other thing that got me about this is I'm like, you have an entire industry that you yourself have been encouraging up till now, of streamers who you've also encouraged to make content for you. And I think that's another thing about this. WotC also misjudged its own employees. Because one of the things we were talking about, these presidents, well, they were hired from outside. The people they promoted were all the people that Hasbro promoted were yes, they're all WotC people, but they're WotC people who were brought in over longstanding people and longstanding writers, including the mechanics writers for D&D 1. So I suspect there's also some internal stuff going around about this, because the leaks started being a lot more than creators leaking parts of the attempted NDA to OGL because they refused to sign it, and started being like WotC employees leaking like discussions that we're having in the business, saying that like, hey, we weren't even told about the OGL changes until afterwards, and then we were told to clean it up. Like
it does seem like there is actually like a lot of anger within Wizards of the Coast, particularly the creative team and people who come out of the creative team, about the direction that these executives that have been brought in from Microsoft and Amazon, that they brought these people in. They're trying to apply lessons, as you said, Discourse, like, this is how things work to Amazon. It worked in Amazon. It's going to work here at WotC. They're applying these, and people who understand the industry are like, this is suicide.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I wonder if this will be the fallout for this will be so bad that the only way Wizards sees of saving it is actually by making booting some of these big executives, because perhaps we can talk about some of the reaction of the community to this discourse. People, we've mentioned, people got mad, and people get mad in all the time in the Dungeons and Dragons community over all kinds of nonsense. But here there was they've annoyed their creators, they've annoyed their streamers, but it's not just that they're annoyed. They've actually taken some action, and some moves from some of these big creators have been made very quickly in response to these leaks. So could you outline some of that discourse for us? And then Varn, perhaps you could follow up.
I think that the most important thing that's happened is that people have begun to cancel their Dungeons and Dragons Beyond subscriptions. I think that is actually probably the most impactful thing that has happened. There has been a huge movement to begin canceling subscriptions, which is money directly being taken out of the pocket of Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro. And that actually matters a lot. So you can write like letter campaigns, you can send emails, you can write, you can do all that sort of performative kind of stuff. Companies don't care because they will weather it. They know that this passes, right? I mean, how many outrages, how many community backlashes have we seen in the past? And then it just kind of simmers down and ends. This is real, because these recurring revenue streams, they require people to kind of forget about the subscription and just pay in every month and then just not think about it. But now that they're losing a bunch of customers, that's actually really bad. They're going to reacquire those people. So I think that's really important. Secondly, I will say people are discovering a lot of Wizards competitors right now. I admin a Dungeons and Dragons community for like the kind of area that I'm from, and I had to fight personally tooth and nail to get a section in our Discord server for other role playing games. Right? It's like it's named after Dungeons and Dragons, and I had to fight to get a section there. People are whispering me and sending me messages asking me like, "Are we going to change? Like, can we change the name?" People want to change the name from Dungeons and Dragons to just like tabletop role playing because suddenly they have realized what it means to have a single company be the custodian and steward of a hobby. How it can go really bad when they feel like they're in a position to push things as far as they want to. And now people are beginning to actually support other companies. I mean, this is exactly what happened, as Varn mentioned. This is exactly what happened with 4th edition as well. People moved from Dungeons and Dragons to Pathfinder. And honestly, Paizo now as well, they've come out with the Orc, their new open gaming license as well, which is essentially a replacement system. And they have joined with Kobold Press and Chaosium and Green Ronin and all these other third parties, and they have completely pulled the rug from under Wizards of the Coast now. And they're getting such great press out of this. I think more people are finding out about Pathfinder over the last week than had ever heard of it before.
I mean, I've seen a lot. I've seen a lot of creators, for example, who do D&D content. I forget who I saw a video from the Dungeon Dudes. I don't know if they're friends or a couple, but the Dungeon Dudes, they do pretty good content, and they were talking about 5 RPGs that you've never heard of.
I have that video written and recorded. I just haven't had a chance to get it out and edit it.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
But it's really, I mean, to return to the whole moral economy issue is, you know, in a lot of other gaming spheres, in video games, for example, you know, there is a small elite of players in video games who are super engaged in video games, but most people who play computer games are basically just like logging on, playing. They have no engagement with the companies. They don't care who EA is. They don't care about anything. They just want to play their game and turn up. With something like Warhammer 40,000 and Games Workshop, they have the sunk cost issue where you have to pay thousands and thousands of dollars. So you're in for a penny, in for a pound. Once you're in the Games Workshop ecosystem, you've bought all your models and you just like, well, I need to play. But
Games Workshop have refined that customer base over a very long period of time. They've whittled it down to the last few people who are like, thanks, Games Workshop.
People, you know, Games Workshop YouTube channels are basically, you know, a lot of like, give me the Space Marines. I love the Space Marines. I need more Space Marines. I'm telling you, man, I love them. So they've really done that. But it's partly because people have. I need my Space Marine, Daddy. Give me my Imperial fisting, and then.
I wonder who that could be.
No one. No one. That could be no one. But it's because people sink a lot of money into it, right? Mm-hmm. But Dungeons and Dragons is, in many ways, a lifestyle brand. The WotC people understood this, but they misunderstood the attraction of what that lifestyle brand is. A lot of people who played it, D&D did a lot of work. And, you know, I know that you have the old grumpies who are always like, oh, they've made like elves black. How can you have a black elf? It's like, it's elves. They don't exist. They've done a lot of things to promote diversity, which makes sense. They have like the community, I would say, is generally open. It's kind of a progressive community, at least in terms of its values. You know, I know a lot of trans people who play, a lot of LGBTQ people play, and increasingly more and more minority people from minorities are playing, and it's kind of grown in that way. That doesn't jive, right, with we're going to crap on your favorite creators, because of course a lot of the popularity of Dungeons and Dragons is created through these parasocial relations with content creators, especially Critical Role. I mean, people talk about, you know, the Matt Mercer effect as a Matt Mercer, the head of Critical Role, the GM for Critical Role, has shaped the way that people perceive Dungeons and Dragons to be how it should be played. And WotC totally misunderstood. They were thinking, oh, they say D&D, that means they love D&D, the brand. But D&D for many people is just a generic term for role-play game. It's like saying Hoover or Kleenex or Band-Aid, all these kind of things,
Yeah.
and they misjudged it.
Can I just say that I don't think that the Dungeons and Dragons IP is particularly strong. Honestly, I think they've misjudged the strength of their IP. The most people I know who play Dungeons and Dragons don't really care about like Forgotten Realms or you know like they're not invested necessarily in the world, like the setting and the kind of characters like Drizzt or whoever. What they care about are their Tibble's version of Dungeons and Dragons, their Tibble's version of the homebrewed world that their DM has made. I mean, sure, it might be still Forgotten Realms, but it's their DM's version of Forgotten Realms. It's their DM's NPCs. Dungeons and Dragons is an engine. It's mechanics. That's what people have actually latched onto. That's what they use. They use it as a toolbox to build their own little, to build their own little games. And so I think that they've misjudged because they think they have something like Warhammer, where everybody just wants space. They just love Space Marines. But that's not the case with Dungeons and Dragons. That's not the case. And Wizards don't have the strength to be able to just push through changes like this.
Yeah, they seem to strangely like both lean into the progressive values, and I want to say some things about I'm all about against progressive values. I think diversity is great, but a lot of creators and a lot of the fan base learned that literally they were really naive, but they learned you can use progressive values as a censorship thing to like censor whatever you want, like yeah, I've heard more people say this week, like, they could have always just told people who used their stuff for racist stuff to cease and desist. Actually, the OGL, if it wasn't irrevocable in general, if it's irrevocable in general, it was also irrevocable in specific. Revocable in specific to specific people who like UTSR, who was deliberately trolling stuff. And that's woken a lot of people up to the fact that a lot of these companies, pinkwash, greenwash, etc., and use it for other things. And I think that's a new thing. And I think one thing we need to note about that is there seemed to have been a campaign that D&D launched on its own history simultaneously. There was all these like think pieces that had industry people coming out talking about like, our racist history, but you should play basically, D&D 1 has gotten past that. Like, we have excised Gary Gygax, which I also find kind of interesting. Because
they also slandered the OSR, the independent RPG community, as being like, the OSR has some pretty gross people in it in the past, but like that's a tiny minority of these independent RPGs. But definitely, I think it feels like there was some kind of campaign to do that. I agree. Go ahead.
I mean, even if you look at the statement from Wizards yesterday, if you look at their response to the kind of OGL backlash, they open with a discussion on we needed this to prevent racism and bad community content. Like that is their first justification that they have for trying to prevent third party, basically for trying to update the OGL terms. Then their second one is NFTs.
Which
NFTs of which the only people who have ever talked about Dungeons and Dragons NFTs are Hasbro, and they said they're looking into it. So,
right, yeah, and the last thing they mentioned was major corporations, and every source I've seen has mentioned this. The biggest corporation that their competitor, Paizo, has 1/10 of their staff and 1/100th of their income flow. Like,
5 million. They are 5 million. Paizo has got a net worth of 5 million. Hasbro is 8.5 billion. Wizards of the Coast are 1 billion, or 5 billion. Oh no, 1 billion. Yeah.
It's what, but I mean, like the order of magnitude difference about that is nuts to me. And while a lot of their statements seem to clearly be like, I'm not going to say Paizo, but Paizo, they're also kind of clearly, I'm not going to say Matt Mercer, but Matt Mercer, which I'm like, that's, you are literally killing the primary thing. And I couldn't figure out what they were trying to do, because one of the things that they seem to do, that this would talk about their overvaluing of the IP, is they seem to really think that their new growth in independent markets is based off of pre-third ed TSR nostalgia. All right, because that's and I say that because it's also shown up in their product links in weird ways. Like, one of the things about Wizards products is they'll mention stuff from like 1985 in a new book, as if they think that anyone now is going to know that. I've been playing D&D since like 1989, and I don't know some of the, like, I don't know the ins and outs of Greyhawk, really. Like, I know it exists, but
I think that people like the idea of it. Like, I think that based mostly on Stranger Things. I think people like the idea of that kind of old school kind of role playing. But actually, most people just want to make characters and get the dungeons. They don't want to
Do a bit of murder hoboing in a dungeon.
There's no nostalgia, I don't think. Really, there's not a lot of it.
I definitely think. I mean, I think the COVID pandemic was far more important than nostalgia. Of course, there's a bit of 80s nostalgia, but when you had a bunch of people coming into the hobby because they're stuck at home and they play on Zoom or one of these VTTs like Roll20, I think that was far more important for giving people time to say, hey, you know what? I enjoyed playing Dungeons and Dragons back in the day, or Dungeons and Dragons seems pretty cool, or my friends are playing Dungeons and Dragons. Because, even by the 90s, things like Dungeons and Dragons were far more mainstream than they had been in the 1980s. Role-play games, like, I know tons of people who grew up in the 90s like me, and they knew Warhammer, they knew role-play games, and they weren't like, oh, you're the role-play game nerds. I mean, I remember, funny story, in 2001, watching a Vampire the Masquerade group go to a nightclub and beat up some punks in a fight. So it wasn't like the preserve of nerds or something. It was like relatively mainstream. And people started playing. And Wizards of the Coast miscalculated, because people were playing online, but just because there's a computer involved, it doesn't make it a video game.
Yeah,
it's an analog hobby, and
so,
people play online because you can't be close to the people you want to play with all the time, and it facilitates play, but ultimately that play is still analog play. And this whole move towards video gamification shuts down the creativity that role-play games have. Like, the point of a role-play game is that your DM can do whatever. You're not
do anything. I can change it at any time.
Exactly.
So I want to talk about the role play, the video gamification, and in particular, my thesis that modern corporate people are dumb even for corporate people, because one of the things that has been the D&D, the WotC's frustrated with right now, they released a whole bunch of video game content, licensed a whole bunch of video game content. They lost money on it. They gained, however, a whole lot of stuff over COVID as far as the doubling of book sales. But they've had trouble with book sales this year too. And one of the things that I've been pointing out in their new releases is they video gamified the rules, and also have been releasing books that don't have complete mechanics. So it's like, well, how do we play from the books? Which makes it seem, which I think was beginning to get backlash from the nerd crowd, because they were realizing that, like, you really couldn't play a lot of this stuff unless you went into D&D 1, where their gamified ecosystem would finish out the mechanics for you. And while this year has been particularly a nostalgia year, 2 out of 3 books are like, oh, we're bringing back Starjammer, which, for a nerd like me, is aimed at nerds like me. But then we get it, and like, well, you didn't even finish writing the book. we're bringing back Dragonlance, but you like there's your rules in that book and your world things actually don't match up. And what I find particularly fascinating about this is part of the reason why WotC was having trouble, despite making a ton of money off of the expansion of like base core D&D and the online D&D, facilitated world, and also in hardcover books, is that it was the video games that lost the money this year. Like, it specifically was the video games that lost the money. So I was like, why on earth, if you are seeing that your video games are losing money, are you going to try to video gamify again the
potential
tabletop
is
role
there.
playing in yes,
the potential for so much money, like times
That's
a
true.
million money, right? Like if they can sell every single player who currently doesn't, those mean old players won't give Hasbro their money. Those guys don't want to pay any money at all. If they can convince those people to spend even $5 a month, right? This is why D&D Beyond cancellation subs are so big right now. If they can get them to pay $5 a month, and if they can find the odd person who'll pay hundreds of dollars, on these kind of things that cost almost nothing to make, it's worth it then, right? Like, because then the actual find is so much bigger.
So one of the things that I was looking at for that call that I've only seen one person mention, but I found it on the call, is they said they wanted the average player to spend the same amount as the average dungeon master right now, which I will say, as a dedicated dungeon master and also a book addict, that moves the hobby for something that that does seem actually like a very Games Workshop move, where we're going to eliminate the size of our audience so that we have an addicted audience, and
Monetized.
and fully monetized down to microtransactions and NFTs.
But again, it misjudges the market, because one of the attractions of D&D is that the GM, he's kind of like he or she is kind of like a groomer. You groom people. Come on, play some Dungeons and Dragons.
You don't want to use that word.
Yeah, I was about to say.
Okay, maybe the some kind of synonym for groom, but it is very much something where you, as a GM, bring people into the game, and the attraction for players is that it is exactly a low investment thing. Like,
yes,
it's like it's free. It's like you get a book. I mean, you get a book, your imagination, and you talk and you create a collective story. Some people like to do a bit more of the combat. Some people like to, but it misjudges. Like a company like Games Workshop, foundationally, everybody playing a Warhammer game needs the minis, right? So, you can't be a passive Warhammer player. I mean, you could be a lore consumer and things like that, but, you can be very into D&D for very little money. And if you're not super wealthy, that's like an attractive, like, not all nerds are middle class or upper class. There's a lot of people who want to play role play games who are not super rich. And hey, the DM has the book. He or she is going to give me the photocopy, so I do my character sheet, or we go on the thing, and that's all I need to do. And that them trying to monetize it misunderstands the game that they have.
Well, I mean, I get, but I think my big thought about this is, like, despite the fact it's a lowly monetized hobby, you guys have managed to turn a business model that, frankly, the reason why, like, most of these, like Paizo, is worth $5 million, which is big but not that big, and only has like 100 employees, is because it is an old school market that has never been very, like, even in the height of 80s D&D, where you can get like D&D stuff in the Sears fucking catalog for Christmas, it's never been easily super monetizable. And when Wizards has accepted that, they've actually made a ton of money. Like, that's the funny thing. If you look at the history, and I think one of the things that's going to really hurt Wizards now is now people are learning about the history of D&D who weren't particularly interested before, because now I've heard a lot more people bring up 4th edition. I've heard a lot more people bring up the old TSR wars, and I'm like,
Yes,
oh,
D&D Insider.
yeah,
The old virtual tabletop attempts.
right. And I was even going to mention, Gene, because I think the story of a lot of our show when we talk about these like hubristic big companies, I mean, we can always mention White Wolf. So far, any one of them that tries to put a ton of investment in a digital market, be an MMORPG or anything like that they completely control, they go out of business. Like, I don't think that's going to happen with D&D, but I'm just looking at the history and going like, I get the temptation, but like, look at the history here. You guys go out of business when you do this. Like, and why I think the trust is so particularly hurt is, like I said, now people know about stuff they didn't know about before, that have like, because the goodwill around D. I think that's what they were hoping, is there's so much goodwill in this other community that they're just not going to learn about the fact that this kind of move has collapsed the hobby. I mean, particularly in the 90s, it almost completely destroyed D&D as a thing. And while, you have to be old to remember when I was in my 20s, if it wasn't for 3.0, nobody still played Dungeons and Dragons in the 90s. Like, it was a time where people, like, you were a 14-year-old and you're trying to get your hands on Palladium or something like that. Like, and immediately I knew how serious it was, because all these things have been marketing D&D based stuff forever. But by Tuesday, we're already like, find your non-OGL games. Here is Shadows of the Demon Lord and Fantasy Age and all this stuff that a lot of these third party publishers who had their own games have kind of like not really invested in, because no one's been buying them, and everyone's like Fantasy Age sold out. Like,
Yeah.
like I haven't heard anyone talk about Fantasy Age ever. Like,
I bet Paizo are getting a big bump in sales.
Oh, I mean, Monty Cook started sending out free versions of Cypher System and put Cypher System on sale, and also reminded people that Cypher System has its own and separate OGL. Like, I just was like, everybody else has been like, hey, we got games and we're going to sell them to you for cheap. We're going to loss lead right now. So, so that you get into our system and our game world. Like,
isn't this, though, almost like a return to normality? Like, I mean, in a lot of ways, the actual dominance of Dungeons and Dragons over the entire marketplace was kind of the weird bit, because for the longest time, it was the case that there was a variety of competitors inside the market. Like, even in the 90s, like White Wolf was arguably one of the biggest TTRPGs at the time, but there was a ton of variety then. In the 2000s, it was the same thing when 4th edition came out, and then for a while there, it felt like all anybody ever wanted to talk about was 5th edition Dungeons of Dragons, and it felt like the hobby, the role-playing game hobby, had ossified around this single game system. And now Wizards have accidentally dropped the ball so hard that they've shattered their hold. Their stranglehold, and now everybody's finding out about these other games, and it could be that we see the return of that variety.
I think you're right. I think 100%. We see this in a lot of other fields. We see this in wargaming. The dominance of a single company leads to a kind of conservatism in rule design. Rules bloat, very common in these kind of things, and 5e was getting that way, right? We saw with 5e, when 5e first started, it's not the greatest rule system of all time, but if you just have those core books, it's a pretty solid rule system, and it's easy to teach people. And there'll be people who dog on 5e, but it's like, no, part of its success was because it had a reasonable system. But we've seen this expansion of subclasses, and you could play turtle or a cat person, all kinds of stuff, right? And I think, yeah, once they get into this dominant position, it becomes game by committee, and you end up with kind of a moribund gaming system, and also the gaming world. And I think you're absolutely right, Discourse, to highlight it earlier. They didn't. They overestimated how people care about their IP. Like, they're investing in this D&D movie. It's gonna bomb. I am pretty sure.
Yeah,
this
I've
D&D
never known a D&D movie to do well, and there's been 3. Like,
I mean, I think
I think it might do okay.
You think
it might
so?
well, I think it
Yeah.
might have done okay. Like, I don't know that it's still going to do it.
I mean, they've really. I mean, I just. It's an engaged community, right? Like, it's quite involved to be a RPG. It's not something you can just passively consume without, investing yourself in. And they've just misjudged it. And I think ultimately, I think it's a scary time for a lot of third-party creators, people who have built their careers on it. I mean, you've got your Matt Colvilles, you've got your Matt Mercers, people who are veterans of the industry. I mean, Matt Colville basically called this back in August when Wizards of the Coast bought D&D Beyond, which, despite the name D&D, was originally a third-party company. When he called it that, they're going to try and tighten their grip on things. But then you have a whole bunch of people who are online creators. I mean, I've seen people who, I'm not going to say 100%, I'm sure, but like, it looks like they've been crying for like 4 hours because their livelihood is going to be here's
the crazy thing, right? There's already been a massive impact on the industry by the existence of the leaks of the OGL 1.1. There have been third parties have had to cancel projects. There are freelancers that have already lost gigs and jobs as a result of this. Sponsors have begun to pull out. I've already seen sponsors have begun pulling out. This has already made a massive impact. Small third-party publishers have had to hire lawyers to try and work out what the actual impact of the new OGL will be. And that has had massive reverberations on the wider market already, and that's before it even has come out.
Yeah, that any Kickstarter right now that was, I mean, I think the real gloat has I used to try to keep up with all the 5e Kickstarters. I didn't invest in all of them and at least follow them. I can't even follow them all anymore, but every one of them is in doubt now because because a lot of people are like, okay, it takes a year to get some of these things out. Are you even going to be able to get it out with this OGL kerfuffle? Are you going to go out of business if we actually got you big enough to really ensure a good product? Because I don't think people understood this at first. I'm like, but the OGL is at gross revenue, not profits. So and I don't, the profit rate for physical commodities and publishing is real low. So a 25% royalty on gross.
You're driving them out of business, basically. You're driving all but the biggest people out of business.
Right. And a lot of and so if you're a single creator who gets a big Kickstarter, blows up, you actually probably won't be able to deliver the Kickstarting project.
Well, it's everything above 750,000.
Yeah, but have you I'm just thinking you do 1,000 book print run on a hardcover book like that, everything above 750,000 would have been still every major fifth ed Kickstarter this year, because a lot of them hit 1 million or very close to it. Well, and they're probably not profiting more than 15K off that.
I mean, people see these big $1 million Kickstarters and they're like, oh, they must be rolling in money. It's like, they're not. I mean, a lot of that money is going into production, right? There's some profit and you can run a company, but you're not living, you're not in a private jet off.
You're not a Hasbro executive.
You're not a
700,000 a year.
Yeah, I don't think Matt Colville is flying around America in a private jet because of strongholds and followers, right? People see big numbers, but I mean, both Val and I have worked in publishing, and we know how crappy the margins are, and we produced really poor quality books, right? Like the cheapest crap, right?
I mean, the quality demand on RPG books. I actually was pointing out this has been a problem for like Drive Through RPG for a long time because their print on demand stuff can't deliver the quality people have actually gotten used to. But like I pull out books that I have from 80s RPGs or 90s RPGs and even early aughts RPGs, and I'm like, no one would accept this now. Like they're gonna want a full color book with stitch bound, and I'm like, dude. Even the biggest companies in the 90s did not do stitch bound. Like so people
Stitch
have
bound
to
is
make
nice though. It's nice.
it is
Stitch
not
bound.
well, I'm all about it. Like, don't get me wrong, I now don't buy books from Drive Through RPG because they fall apart, but that was the industry standard in the 90s. There's a reason why it's kind of hard to find some of those books now because they just weren't made well, but that's become like normalized. Like, I mean, like I even think about like the OSR community, like them in particular. You better have a nice book, like a nice physical book, which means your profit margins are going to be low. And that's, I mean, that's okay. I mean, people can live off that if they do 3 of those a year, make 20, 30, 40, 20, 30K off of it. You support 2 or 3 people working on it together. You can do that. And that's been the mainstay of the industry now. But it's like, I am like, because I was reading this, I'm like, that 750,000 sounds like a lot, but if you've worked in publications, you just know that like, oh, unless you're doing print on demand, you can go through that like that.
Wait, Farn, are you saying that all these Kickstarters are not by massive megacorps? Is that what are you saying that they're not huge commercial companies?
I mean,
conglomerates?
the biggest companies don't use Kickstarters. I like to point out Pazzo doesn't Kickstart stuff. The biggest company I know that does consistent Kickstarters is Cobalt. Like, and
but these are minnows compared to the Hasbro.
They're tiny.
I mean,
yeah.
I mean, it's just the marketplace. I mean, frankly, I think going forward, Wizards of the Coast is going to try and roll this back. They're going to try and, as they say, polish the turd and say, and perhaps put forward another OGL that has slightly better terms in the hope that people will go, oh, at least it's not the terrible one. But I think they.
Well, so they're calling it OGL 2.0 is what because I might have had a little document sent to me, falling into my lap. And it matches essentially what they had said in their statement, their public statement on D&D Beyond. And there are some walkbacks and some points. The royalty fee is now been amended from 25% to 20% for everybody on anything over 750,000.
Yeah, although what's funny, their statement made it sound like they weren't doing royalties at all.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, but there's no royalty structure, so it's all good. But there's really been very little substantive changes. I think there's been a lot of performative changes. So, for example, they spent an entire paragraph trying to make clear that you still own everything, but that doesn't matter because if you're signing away the rights and you're allowing them to monetize it, and license it without your, without
is the back license still in there?
Yeah.
Because they said
I haven't seen the actual legal document. I've seen an FAQ, like a document that seems to have been appended onto the new OGL licensing. So it's kind of a clarificationary document.
Well, there was a leak, an apparent leak to one of the D&D creators from someone within Wizards of the Coast who was saying precisely that Wizards of the Coast leadership thinks that they can weather this storm.
Yeah.
And they might have thought, well, we have to react. We can't, I mean, the storm has been bigger than we expected, and we have to react. And their reaction will be slightly to amend things. What do they call it in negotiations? They call it anchoring, right? Where you make a very big claim, and then when you roll it back,
It's a compromise then.
It's a compromise then. So
Right.
they're trying to do that. I think, one thing I'm hopeful for, I think the D&D community, and this is what I've actually said for a while, and people in some of the forums and the discords have been skeptical about it. It's like, I'm like, I don't know. I think the D&D community is uniquely positioned as a hobby community compared with other hobbies anyway, to push back on companies like Wizards of the Coast, uniquely positioned. And if the community and the influencers in particular, who are really the people they're the people who people have the parasocial relationship with. They don't have the parasocial relationship with the abstract brand of D&D. They have it with these people that they follow, they know, and that they trust, right? I mean, I love me some Matt Colville. He's my hero. I want to be like Matt Colville when I'm 50. That's my
Matt
aim.
Covell and Monty Cook are my people, and like I was already loyal to Monty, but that's neither here nor there.
Who's your favorite Discourse? Since we're having
Jim Murphy. That's who I
Jim-
want to be. I want to be Jim Murphy, Matt Colville's DM.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
So
DM like it's 1975, baby.
But this, I mean, people. So those community leaders, like if Matt Mercer comes out and says, "Screw you, D&D, I'm going to play Pathfinder," he's not going to lose his audience, right? Like the audience
They're
is
there for
not
him.
they're his audience, right? You know, there's a reason that they have their own Amazon show that did okay, right? Because
I did actually hear. So I did actually hear one of the big podcasts. So I don't listen to a lot of the D&D podcast. One of the big podcasts did move from Dungeons and Dragons once. I think they moved on to a different system, and their audience levels did drop. I think it might have been the Acquisitions Incorporated podcast. They moved to a different system, and that actually did result in they went back to Dungeons and Dragons as a result.
Yeah, there's another show that moved. I can't remember what it is either because I don't listen. I listen to some gaming industry podcasts, but not the what I don't like listening to other people roleplay. One of the things that one of the guys moved. One of them moved from they moved from D&D and lost people, but then they didn't gain them back when they went to D&D, so they moved off anyway. So I do think, but I don't think that'll happen now because like if you look at YouTube right now, I think people who like don't even care about D&D are hearing about this OGL thing that they've never ever cared about. And
I mean, it was in the Financial Times. I read they had a story in the Financial Times about it.
Yeah, it's gotten beyond Gizmodo, so it is, and a lot of these things have exploded. And I also think one of the funny things is there is a book about D&D's history that actually makes all this stuff really clear. That's also come out right now. The Slaying the Dragon book, which is talking about it's about their legal history. And I'm like, oh man, I bet that guy's really actually ironically happy right now because there's gonna be a lot of people like, wait, and WotC's destroyed its other property this year already.
Oh yeah, Magic the Gathering people are mad too.
And Magic the Gathering's been struggling for a while. I mean, but Magic the Gathering did have the it had the collector status, and the secondary market for Magic's been insane for like 20 years. But it also had recently, people were telling me it had the same dynamic as Games Workshop, where like they were monetizing it to the point that a lot of people were having to get out of it because otherwise they felt like they were just losing money and being addicted. And so I think like Hasbro owned WotC has totally lost trust in two communities, and they've done it kind of the same way by like trying to be the only game in town, having monopolistic practices, etc. Um, and I think that's fair. I mean, one thing I will think people need to notice too, you're right about the monetization. I suspect for WotC that the books are a loss leader, because not if you buy them from like mom and pop stores, you're gonna pay $60 for them, but on Amazon they're the cheapest role playing books available. Like they're so deeply discounted.
Yeah, well, definitely those starters packs are as well.
Yeah. So I figure that they must be like not making a whole lot of money on the actual book end of it anyway. So it's interesting, but I do think I agree with you Discourse, that I think this is going to be fairly good for the community because one, there's going to be another OGL that's not owned by anybody. I mean, the thing about the thing Paizo's doing is Paizo's like, and we don't own it and we can't change it. And we're actually going to put all the language that wasn't in the OGL in it and leave us alone, but it's there. So please buy your stuff. Like, cause like,
Yeah,
like
it's look, the market forces make it for them. So we're coming up, we've been on this for a while. Discourse, do you have some final thoughts to leave us with on this whole situation?
Oh wow. I
the
think I've got a
final-
lot. I've got I've got a lot of thoughts, but I will be brief. I think that honestly, personally speaking, I have been a little bit inspired by the D&D community. I genuinely was surprised to see that there were so many people that had been angered enough to take actual concrete actions and do things like cancel their subscriptions. Genuinely, I was surprised. Maybe I've been in wargaming for too long, and I just thought that like nothing would actually come of this. There'd be some performative rage, and then that would be it.
You've been yelling into the void about Games
Yeah.
Workshop.
And now I'm like, oh my god, finally, actual action. And one of the things is as well is that this has come at the possibly one of the worst times for Wizards of the Coast. Like you guys mentioned about Magic the Gathering, obviously in a bit of trouble, but also moving in towards 1D&D. They need to transition people from Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition to 1D&D. That was already going to be a little bit of a task. Now it has become a nightmare because you're going to have people saying things like, well, if we're moving system, right? Like, why not? Why don't we maybe try out this Pathfinder I've heard all about recently, right? Like, so I think this is a very dangerous time for Wizards of the Coast. I don't know. Maybe it's a management issue. And yeah.
So with that optimistic note, I want to thank everybody for listening on the podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, thank you for joining us. Remember to like and subscribe. Check out VarnVlog. Check out Discourse Miniatures. Check out Dungeons and Discourse Dungeon. The Discourse Dungeon.
Dungeons and
Discourse. The Discourse Dungeon. That's what I'm going to call it. The Discourse Dungeon is where Chris Catrone takes people to read Lukács. Anyway, check that out. And I think on Sunday the 22nd we will be doing another live stream of a TTRPG which is not owned by Wizards of the Coast. We'll be playing Mothership, which I think is a really cool space horror science fiction. I'll be honest with everybody, I'm not super into the fantasy stuff when I do prefer the science fiction stuff, but it is what it is. But as we say on This Is Revolution, we are out.